morning, Dublin. Wonderful to see everybody here. Just amazing energy. It's a real pleasure to be here and talk a little bit about what we see at Stack Overflow about the future of technology from the lens of the developer. So, hopefully the slides come up here in a second. All right, okay, we're up and running. So my name is Prashanth Chandrasekar. I'm the CEO of Stack Overflow. It's a real honor to actually lead this community and company from all around the world. Many of you that are software developers in the audience probably know us, hopefully love us. If you're not a software developer and you're a technologist or a technology leader, you probably have heard of us. If you are not a technologist in general, I urge you to talk to technologists in your company, because it's very likely that they leverage us in some capacity. So a little bit about Stack, for those of you that are unaware of us. So we are the world's largest software developer platform and community. We serve close to 100 million monthly visitors, many of you who are in the room. We have close to 50 million questions and answers on every possible technology topic. Programming language, scripting language, cloud technology, so you name it. Python, JavaScript, AWS, Microsoft Azure. All this knowledge exists on Stack Overflow, and it's the largest knowledge base of information that people leverage. We have, because of this tremendous amount of traffic, it makes us a top 200 website in the world. And that's amazing because, again, it's all because of our users who find the information valuable. They take the time to contribute and really be able to sort of generate sort of the network effects that makes that happen. The activity on our website is fairly significant. A question is asked on our platform every 14 seconds around the world. So it's quite significant in terms of the velocity. And then finally, as I mentioned, the way in which it's leveraged in the technology universe is quite significant. So we have 80% of the world's developers that leverages Stack Overflow literally on a weekly basis. 50% of the world's software developers or technologists leverage Stack Overflow on a daily basis. So odds are, if you go and check with your favorite Stack Overflow developer in your company or your organization, they have a tab of Stack Overflow open on their computer at most times. All right, so in addition to that, we have an entire software as a service paid set of products, and what we call Stack Overflow for Teams, which is used by large companies like Microsoft to the order of about 100,000 users, or large financial services institutions, big banks, et cetera, that leverages the private version of Stack Overflow within their companies to share knowledge and collaborate the same way that all of you do it in the context of our public platform. So as part of my job, I speak to CTOs and CIOs literally on a weekly basis. And the themes of me talking to them generally sort of boil down to three things. They all care about hiring and retention. And the reason for that is that there's a massive supply-demand imbalance. There are about 300,000 tech jobs out there that are unfilled, which is great news for developers in the room. But also, people and HR departments are really struggling to fill these jobs around the world. So that's the first issue. The second issue is that, if you remember, in my late professor from business school many decades ago, Clayton Christensen from Harvard Business School, coined the term disruptive innovation. And it talks about how companies are getting disrupted by startups, and incumbents are sort of put on notice to actually innovate very rapidly. And that's effectively what larger companies are going through. They're being forced to innovate. This has been put on steroids, in a matter of speaking, through the pandemic. And they're all driving fairly big transformations. Cloud transformations, AI, ML, big data transformations, in some cases even blockchain transformations. And so I'll speak a little bit about what they're actually doing. And then finally, because of the pandemic and because of remote work, because of hybrid work, a lot of the technology leaders are struggling with what is the right way to manage their workforces, or how do they keep them happy in the context of this remote environment? And should they ask everybody to come back to the office? Should they actually give them flexibility? And you see a lot of companies trying to do it one way or the other, pulling back. There's a lot of confused messages. So there's a lot to talk about there, too. All right, so I'm going to dig into each one of these, including hiring and retention, which I'll go through. But all of this is I'm going to share some data and it's going to come from our yet-to-be-released 2022 developer survey by Stack Overflow, which is done. It's an annual survey. Perhaps many of you in the audience have contributed to it. So this is a preview of it. We'll be sharing the full survey fairly soon. This is much anticipated. In addition, some of the content that I'll share will be technical, but also some not. And because of the diverse nature of the audience, I wanted to make sure that we appeal to at least both parties. So with that, with hiring and retention, what we have discovered is that the technology stack that the company is using is super important to developers. And this comes through in the context of people interviewing for jobs, right? So over 30% of interviewees are dropping out of interview processes just based on the technology stack that the company is using. So if you're wondering what's going on, hey, if you're a .NET shop or a Python, or if you're using the LAMP stack, or if you're an AWS infrastructure hosted, or you're an Azure shop, all those make a difference to prospects. In addition, tools that you're using internally absolutely make a difference. So this is an interesting insight based on our research. And by the way, the research that we're conducting is close to about 80 to 100,000 people a year respond to our surveys, right? So they're fairly meaningful in terms of numbers. In addition, over 60% of the developers that we've talked to indicate that flexibility is super important in terms of what they actually care about in terms of their employers. So flexibility means how they do their work, the hours that they are supposed to operate under, the location at which they're supposed to work. So it's fascinating that people put such a high priority. And this is amongst all the factors, flexibility ranked the highest in our research, which is quite fascinating for us. In addition, productivity is obviously something that developers, we've all understood this. When we are writing code, and you never want to be, as we like to say in Stack Overflow, we want to be in the flow of work, right? You never want to be distracted. You don't want to context switch. And this is a super important concept for developers. And 50% of those who responded to us said that productivity is super important for them when they're considering their current employer or a future employer, and that made them happy, ultimately, to sort of stay in their current jobs. And then, in terms of learning, which is a super important, the learner mindset for developers, which is sort of the foundational element of Stack Overflow, we implicitly allow people to learn, is also very evident in the data. Over 50% of developers really prioritized opportunities to learn as a result of their experiences in their companies. So say either they stay at their companies if they have opportunities to learn and they're being enabled to learn, or if the new company that they're considering is approaching them with new opportunities to learn, not only formally but also informally, those are really sort of deterministic reasons why people leave or stay at jobs. Okay, so talking about learning, here's an interesting stat that we discovered in this upcoming developer survey, is that last year, in 2021, 60% of developers were learning through online resources. That number has gone up to 70% this year in 2022. And so when I say online resources, it sounds kind of obvious, but what does that mean exactly, right? So we looked at the next generation of technologists, the people that are coming to the websites, the folks that are learning how to code, et cetera, and the way they're doing it, this is again from our dev survey, is that, of course, they're leveraging technical documentation, like all of us do, and it's all online. But Stack Overflow is a very large part of that. We're number 2 in that, very closely behind, not very far. And then they're also using things like, how do they go to online videos about coding? It's a very common way for them to learn. And then, you'll notice as this sort of list goes down that the more traditional ways of learning have actually become the minority, right? Coursework and other things like that. Long are the days of the textbooks. I still have my Java programming textbooks in my office just as a memento. But, nobody ever does that anymore, right? So the learning aspect, how people are learning, it has really, really transformed. And the reason why we believe that learning is happening online so much, 70%, is because technology is moving so rapidly. So as we all know, as many software developers know, the level of abstraction at which languages have been created over the past several years and decades really is driving innovation, right? Or they're making up for some fundamental issue like a memory issue, et cetera. And this abstraction all the way started with assembly code and has moved up. And that is the rate at which those languages are being developed and created is really, really rapid. So 70% of the developers are learning at least a new language a year. And approximately 37% of developers are learning a language every few months. So the rate at which people are learning is really driving why they need to be able to learn very, very quickly and keep up with what's going on. So moving to the second area, which is executing big transformations, as I mentioned, right? So same thing, when we think about learning, it's really, we believe, what people are learning today on the website, on Stack Overflow, is going to drive the future of what these CTOs and CIOs, the transformations they're driving. These are the technologies that are going to be used to drive those transformations. So three of the trends that I thought I'd sort of drill into a little bit with our data. Number one, which is very evident, is cloud acceleration. The cloud's been around for a long time, public cloud. I used to lead a cloud business before Stack Overflow. And the public cloud, even though has sort of been adopted through the S-curve by early adopters and mainstream companies, et cetera, there's a tremendous acceleration, but it's happening at a scale that is fairly significant. And I'll show you some data to show that. Secondly, blockchain, ironically, despite the somewhat, there's a lot of religious views about this subject, is actually very, very prevalent in terms of people's interest to learn. And I'll show you how we believe that and why we believe that. And then finally, machine learning democratization. So this is really about people using data across their companies. It doesn't matter just in the tech or the data science team or the big data platform team. It's being used literally in every function across the company, right? So these are the three areas that I'll drill into. So firstly, cloud. What we've noticed is on Stack Overflow is that cloud questions have increased over the past decade 50% on average year over year. So including the past few years. So every year, there's a significant increase in the level of interest to learn about these topics. This is AWS, Microsoft Azure, Google Cloud, and of course, all the 1,800 features that AWS launches on a yearly basis, serverless code, you name it, right? So all of that is happening. And what we notice about the acceleration isn't that the pandemic really accelerated this very significantly. So you'll notice here that just in the first 4 months of the pandemic, right after that breakpoint line, you see an explosion in terms of the number of questions that people are asking. So we believe that the interest in the cloud and acceleration of the cloud has pushed us several years forward just through the pandemic because everybody was really sort of locked up and really, really forced to learn in many ways. So it's been fascinating to see on Stack. In addition, when I was leading the cloud business, there was a lot of debate back in the day about whether we should go with one cloud platform or is multi-cloud a thing. And I can tell you, based on our data, that certainly from a developer standpoint, this is very much a multi-cloud world. So if you are a developer in the audience that knows AWS, it's likely that you have experimented and tried to learn about Google Cloud, as an example, right? And the interlinks between these, and this is real data, what I'm showing you, and this will be shared in our developer survey with more detail. But the confluence of people learning about each of these platforms and the relationships are quite fascinating. So clearly a strong relationship between AWS and Google Cloud. And of course, there are certain elements of why that is, and because of Windows versus not, et cetera, or the .NET stack. And so that is really, really fascinating to see that it is definitely a multi-cloud world. In addition, concepts like continuous integration, DevOps, microservices, unbundling the monolith, as many tech leaders like to say, has become the norm. If you're a company that has not done or has not done these things or has not adopted these principles, has not moved culturally to a DevOps-oriented approach, you are behind the curve, for sure. Because you can see these percentages. These are the number of developers that are actually leveraging these concepts, whether that's microservices architecture, et cetera, has really increased. So I urge you to look at these, because these allow you to really sort of really promote velocity and agility within your company. Staying close to customers, iterating very quickly on features, deploying code multiple times into production, you name it, right? The other concept that was very evident in our data is something called containerization. Again, I'm trying to balance tech and non-tech people in the room, but it's really a very efficient way to run at-scale cloud infrastructures. So what we've noticed is a really large increase in the amount of interest in technologies like Docker, or also when you think about something like Kubernetes from Google, all of these have really sort of increased over the past several years. Very dramatic increase, in fact. And not only on these open technologies, but also in terms of native container technology within AWS, Microsoft Azure, and Google Cloud. They obviously have their own managed services, and even that has increased fairly meaningfully over the past several years. So if you're not leveraging containerization, I urge you to look into it. The third element, or the second element, apologies, is around blockchain. So with all the news about blockchain and, of course, the volatility of the news around the topic, what is still very evident is that the interest is very large. Over the past decade, there's been an 80% increase in the number of blockchain-oriented questions on Stack Overflow. So it's happening, whether we like it or not. And what also is interesting here is that it's actually not just a hobby. It's also entering the workplace. We're seeing a ton of developers experimenting with blockchain-oriented applications within and outside of work, mostly outside of work, as I'll show you. But it is about 30% of them have actually started to use it within the context of their workplace. What does that mean? It means when we looked at that data, it suggests that 70% of that 30% actually came from tech companies. So technology companies are absolutely encouraging their developers or giving them space to actually innovate with blockchain within their companies. So quite fascinating. And I think that what is also really somewhat heartening about this is that the building blocks of building a blockchain application are actually quite similar to everything else that developers love, right? So we think about Python and JavaScript and Docker, what I talked about, or Node.js. All these technologies are still the same building blocks. So there's an extension of what they already know, but in really sort of being able to creatively express in this sort of new form factor. So quite fascinating with these same sort of commonalities. And just to conclude this topic of how do developers really feel about blockchain? I don't mean to go down a touchy-feely subject, but since it's so sort of religious of a topic, we just wanted to see, like, how do people actually believe in this, or do they not? And the reality is that the world is split on this topic, right? There's a big S-curve, and there's a vast number of developers that are quite indifferent to the topic, but there's also a good number of people that think very favorably, or very favorably, or the opposite, or really sort of unfavorable about the topic. So it's quite a polarizing subject. I'm sure you've seen it if you follow social media, et cetera, and that's the reason, because people are still trying to digest if this is something that they should sort of bet their careers on, and so on. Certainly, I can tell you based on the compensation data that we looked at in our developer survey, there's certainly a lot of interest. There's a tremendous spike in compensation for blockchain-oriented developer roles. OK, so finally, the third trend around machine learning. And this topic also very significant increase in questions on Stack Overflow, about 50% over the past decade. And what is great about this, as I mentioned, is that it's being leveraged across the company, not just in the original data science teams, et cetera, where it all started. So it's quite been fascinating to see the types of folks that are actually leveraging these platforms. And one of the couple data points to show you this is that there's been a surge of interest in terms of wanting to really learn machine learning technologies with technologies like TensorFlow, as an example, right? And those of you that are into machine learning know that that's one of the more popular languages, along with something like PyTorch. So clearly, there's an interest to learn about these, and has gone up to the list relative to all the other technologies that they could be spending time on learning on. So this is quite fascinating to see that people are really, this is much further along in terms of the S-curve adoption, in terms of real use, solving real problems, and so on and so forth. And what's also great to see is that there's a true correlation between this data around ML and AI and those sort of technologies, and just in general the growth of something like Python, right? So there's a true correlation that people seem to be combining things like the technologies I mentioned, along with just fundamental building blocks of writing code, like Python. So there seems to be generally, this seems to be pushing the adoption of machine learning applications within companies, and a lot of the applications that are being built seem to be tied to machine learning as a concept. So people are definitely bringing stuff together, which is great to see. All right, and then now the final, to zoom back out, the third macro issue that CTOs and CIOs care about is managing teams in a distributed team environment. So this one, I can tell you with a lot of confidence that remote and hybrid work is the future. It is a one-way train that has left the station, and it's very hard to take something back when you're given something to somebody. And all of you, I'm sure, are beneficiaries of it. I'm sure there are technology leaders in the audience that are debating this and trying to figure out how do you get work done and how do you sort of manage your teams. But this is a one-way train. It's left the station. And the data proves it very clearly. If you're trying to hire developers and you're asking them to come into the office, you're going to be fishing out of a very small pool of about 15% of the audience. So you can make that choice, but you're going to be really, really constrained in terms of the number of people that you're going to be able to get access to. In addition, what we're noticing is that there's the amount of distraction within a company in a distributed environment is quite significant. So it's not perfect. So companies need to adapt. What do they do about this? So there's a ton of time spent on asking questions. There's a ton of time spent on answering questions. All of this is augmented by the number of people that have left companies, are attriting, joining companies, and so on. And so the same sort of topics are being discussed, and there's a lot of distraction within companies, a lot of context switching, and there's a fair amount of inefficiency and knowledge silos within companies. And this has to be solved through tools like asynchronous collaboration tools, which is what obviously we do at Stack as well. But the point is that, in general, this is something that I think is a real pain point for companies. And if you look at some of the macro stats, they really, really want flexibilities and opportunities to learn to be successful in a distributed environment. I'm talking about developers. So over 50% said they would be turned off if they were forced to work on specific working hours. Obviously, developers, I remember coding in the wee hours of the night, trying to debug stuff. And so in that context, I'm sure it's quite constraining to force people. Similarly, it would be very unappealing, as I mentioned, to be forced to come into the office. Or if you really want to make sure that the developer experience is prioritized, the tools that they're using, asynchronous collaboration tools, the technology stack, as I mentioned, super important. And also, if you think about opportunities to learn, really, really, you want to enable them to learn not only the languages, et cetera, but to learn from each other, from other people around the company. And that's super important in terms of knowledge sharing within companies. So inner source and those sort of concepts, which we talk about all the time at Stack, are super critical. And then finally, of course, to enable all this, they're able to sort of really engage with people outside their team, which is a very, very common thing that's happening within companies. So all of these are really important factors. And just to sort of conclude, these are the three topics that I think that technology leaders, if you are a business leader, please go talk to your technology leader about these subjects. And to sort of summarize, I would say that these three topics really center around the developer experience. Right? So if you were to leave with one thing, I would say think about the developer experience, and foundational to that, there is, of course, the opportunities to learn within your company from each other, formally from actual sort of languages and other sort of sources. And ultimately, you want to make sure that this applies across hiring and retention, providing these enabling people to learn, being able to drive these transformations with technologies that developers are learning today for the future, and then ultimately providing them with flexibilities and opportunities to learn so that they can actually operate as effective distributed teams. So that's my conclusion. And of course, at Stack Overflow, we like to say that all learning starts with a question, since we are a Q&A site. You can obviously reach out to me on LinkedIn or Twitter at @Chandrasekar. Also, please feel free to visit our website at stackoverflow.co to learn more about us and our products. So thank you again, and enjoy the conference.